Hello there. We're in London today in Kings Cross, and we're going to be doing an oil painting. Not something I always do, and it's not something I'm particularly brilliant at, but it's an interesting process. This is the final piece here. There's something about oil painting and about the material of oil itself, which is interesting and bizarre and triggers kind of weird things in your head. I'll come back to that. This is Kings Cross Basin. It's part of an area of redevelopment around some old train stations. And they have these things called gas holders, which are sort of Victorian structures that used to be used to, well, obviously hold gas, and they're protected. They're listed, which means they can't be knocked down, so they've converted them into, in one case, they're like a residential building, and in the case of this one here, it's been converted into a kind of park. So they're there as sort of industrial heritage, 1850s, I think they were built. And I'm here to paint. I'm here for at least 3 hours, maybe 3.5 hours. These are something I've always wanted to paint. They're kind of very iconic, and it's a very sort of challenging and interesting kind of object to paint. Now, as you can see, we're working on blue paper. It's actually 300 grams per square meter, so sort of thin card as opposed to thick paper. And it's, let me think, 16 inches by 20, I think, so smaller than A2, a little bit smaller than A2. I've specifically gone smaller because I normally do things like this in A2, and I wanted to just see whether I could, it was better for me if I went slightly smaller, if I just, if time wasn't quite so pressing. And because this is such a structurally complex shape, because it's kind of octagonal, or I didn't count how many sides, but a multi-sided drum with very complex kind of little constructional details, kind of cast iron capitals and trusses and all kinds of stuff going on. So I thought, rather than just launch into the painting that I might normally do, I'm going to give myself a chance by putting some pencil lines. And I got some Posca pencils, which are kind of like an oily, waxy kind of crayon type pencil, and I've used those crayons in order to kind of lay down structural lines. Now, it's an interesting thing, I think, to kind of discuss. When you draw a thing, you can correct a thing. What I mean by that is I am going to draw this in 2-point perspective, so the verticals are vertical. Now, as you can see from the photograph that I took from my seated position, bottom left here, the human eye sees in 3-point. In other words, if you're sitting beside this tower, which obviously has vertical height, then the higher that thing goes up, the smaller those dimensions appear. So, in other words, if it was a massive tower block, if we were in New York, and you had a completely square tower, then as you sat at the bottom and you looked up at it, it would appear to get narrower and narrower, almost like a very slim pyramid, as the dimensions appeared to get smaller the further they were away from you. It's just perspective. So if you take a photograph, that's what you see. A camera is like an eye, 35mm, so you're seeing that sense of the angles of perspective. But when you paint, that's a choice. We're not going to paint this as if it's a life model, as if we're going to look at negative spaces and try to exactly reproduce on the paper exactly that which we can see. Now, we might do that if we did it from a photograph. If I took the photograph bottom left and tried to draw this, paint this, it would look like the photograph, I think. I think we tried to mimic the angles of the 3-point perspective. But I don't have to do that if I'm there. Instead, I'm going to understand what I'm looking at. So I'm understanding the columns, I'm understanding the capitals and the trusses, the construction, the kind of geometry, and I'm translating that into a 2-dimensional view as 2-point perspective. So the verticals are vertical because I choose to. Because as a sort of thinking human being, we can make that transferable. I don't just have to sort of mimic what my eye sees. I can use my brain to translate what it sees into what I know to be true. I know that in reality these columns are not angled. They don't kind of rise to a mythical point in the sky. I know they're vertical, so I can paint them vertical. So if you've never painted or drawn a complex view before, sort of plein air, meaning out in the wilds like this, then it can seem a bit confusing at first, because you think, well, do I paint exactly that which I'm seeing in the way I'm seeing it? And the answer to that is, well, you don't have to. And in fact, there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to, because then you're just sort of, how far is that angle away from there? How much of that building can I see through that little kind of space there? And it just gets very analytical in a way that's a bit boring. Because you're there on site, you've walked around the space. You're looking at it from multiple points of view, and your eyes, seeing in 3 dimensions, understand it on a sort of a reality level. It's not just an image. It's not flat. It's 3-dimensional in a way that your brain can fully embrace and understand. So translating that into a painting style of your choice is actually easy. It's not a difficult thing to do. You're not actually, in a crazy way, this is probably wrong, but you're not really looking at the building that much, or looking at the structure in this case that much, because once you've understood it, you're painting what your understanding is of it, rather than painting the literal physical reality of it. At least as an urban sketcher you are. If I was going to paint this as an artist, I might be thinking about capturing the light, or capturing the textures of the different materials, the old and the new. And take this for example, I'm painting that back building orange, and it isn't. I choose to paint it this colour for the contrast of the dark blue of the structure in front of it. So it's a kind of aesthetic choice, and it's one which is instinctive, and it's one that if you can look at the finished piece, there's like a memory of that orange. That orange becomes overlaid in calmer colours as I kind of work it through, and it becomes something which is a flavour in the background, but it's an interesting kind of intellectual process to have gone through that. It's not like at the beginning of the painting I know exactly what the ending's going to be, not really, but I have enough of a feel for the approach, and I trust the process, that I can just let myself go and make decisions on the fly and enjoy those decisions, and if they're wrong, I change them. I mean, if you look over the building on the left that we're working on now, that building changes multiple times over the time of this painting and this recording, simply because I'm quite enjoying it, and when I start out I want it to be quite a simple form, and it becomes more complex and nearer to the reality of the building. But at no point is it ever a true representation of that building. If you look at the photograph and look at that building in the bottom left, it's much more complex than I paint it. And I don't want it to be that complex in this view, because I don't want it to detract from this Victorian structure, which is the hero of the piece, So I'm making choices, in other words. I'm abstracting certain things and quietening things down, changing their colours, changing how loud they are in the view, and I'm enjoying that decision, and I'm making that decision piece by piece. So I don't feel as if it's something that I'm locked into. I can always change it. I can change my mind whenever I choose to. Now let's talk for a second about plein air. Plein air, French term. It means basically painting, looking at the thing that you're doing. So it can be seen as being painting outside if you're doing outside things. From an urban sketcher's point of view, it means painting outside because you're looking at the thing you're going to represent. You're looking at the thing you're going to sketch, you're looking at the thing you're going to paint. So in that plein air kind of point of view, you get into this world of the immediacy, which actually gets into alla prima, which I think is Italian, not French, and that means, well, people think it means wet in wet. Doesn't mean wet in wet. What it means is all at once. So in other words, you're doing it in one sitting. Now, if you were doing a painting and you had infinite amount of time, you could do an underpainting first. So you could do like it is here, where you've got the basic colors down. You could then allow the painting to dry. You could then add other things to it. Adding wet paint onto dry paint is a very different process. It's much more precise. You could be more delicate. If you're wetting wet, if you're alla prima, so if you're painting all in one go, where you're starting and then you're painting for 3 hours and you're finishing, at no point, in the case of oil paint, has anything dried, not even vaguely thought about it. It's still absolutely sopping wet. If you've never used oil paint before, it's a bit like toothpaste. When you squeeze toothpaste out onto a brush, it has that sense of it's solid, but as soon as you press into it, it's super soft. That's how oil paint feels. And imagine what it's like to paint with it, because it can be a smeary mess in a way that's completely fascinating, but it can be infuriating and dynamically dangerous all at the same time, because you can get yourself completely in a state if you lay on too much color and you're trying to kind of work thick color on top of thick color. It can become a kind of porridgey mess, and it's fantastic. It's so exciting. It's like okay, this makes no sense, but I don't paraglide, I don't parachute, but this is as close as an urban sketcher gets, I think, to those kind of danger sports, because you're taking something in your hands here, maybe not your life, that's silly, but you're taking your credibility in your own hands, because this can go wrong. It can go wrong really fast, because you can just smear. Literally, you're painting with mayonnaise. It's kind of completely madness that anybody should think this is a sensible way of doing anything, but it's magical, and it's something really strange about it. If you paint with acrylic dries fast, and this is a hot day, so it would dry within 5 minutes, I guess, if you applied it thin, and therefore you can do an underpainting, and then you could put a paint on top, and then paint on top, give it 5 minutes after each layer, and you could build, and you could be much more precise and much more controlled, and frankly it would be much more comfortable to do, because you've got the safety net where you can just say, okay, that bit didn't work, I'm just going to paint over the top, and because the lower layer is dry, that's fine, I can just paint something completely different over the top. Take, for example, I choose here to change the color of the sky at this moment. There is already a color down there, that kind of lilac white color, and it's wet, and it's going to be wet for days. So anything I paint on top of it is reacting to that color. I have to basically mix it. So I can't paint over the top of it really, because that lilac is going to be working with it and sort of fighting it. So there's something sort of wildly, dangerously fun about doing that fast without not really having thought through particular decisions or particular details. You're just saying, well, let's put orange here, let's put lilac there, let's put blue there, and you're reacting fast in the full knowledge that you might be wrong and you might change your mind. And it's wild. As an urban sketcher, I should say, if you're a proper artist, you know what you're doing. I was painting with a group this day, and there were some proper artists in that group, and watching them work is a thing of beauty, because they observe, they understand the light, they understand the character. They don't necessarily understand the construction or the geometry, because they're not thinking like that, because they're not really thinking like an urban sketcher would. They're thinking about the mood. And it's a beautiful thing to see, because they're reacting creatively, artistically to a view in a way that can create stunning imagery. For me, I don't see any of this as being mood from my point of view. In fact, I'm really trying to use the same sort of mental thought process I would use if I was using acrylic paint pens, for example. And I'm trying to basically layer, knowing they're going to merge and blend and mix. And I'm looking forward to that kind of blur, that kind of blending that I don't necessarily have control of. It allows me in a crazy way to relax, because again, I know that I haven't really got control of this. It's kind of like, I don't know, sailing a boat, a sailboat, massively strong windy day, and you're just trying to keep it going in the right direction. You're kind of on the edge of losing control the whole time, and you're kind of giggling and screaming with delight because it's so much fun, but it feels a bit dangerous at the same time, because at any moment things can go wrong. I mean, even, silly thing to say, but if I just sneeze too hard, I'd probably blow half the paint away. It's that soft. So it's almost, in sometimes you feel like it's kind of sculptural to use oil paint, because you're kind of pushing the paint around like a relief sculpture in a way that feels, again, bizarre, and as I say, massive fun. Now, that isn't to say I'm happy with this, because I'm not. The end piece, oh man, I learned so much of how I do it differently next time, and they're my favorite lessons. If I can come away from any kind of something I've drawn or sketched or painted and think to myself, if I do that again, this is exactly how I'm going to do it next time, then I'm a winner, because that's the ultimate win as far as I'm concerned. That's true learning, knowing the approach that you would use the next time you did something similar. In fact, I'd love to go back and do the same thing, because I'd do it differently, I'd do it better. And that's wonderful. That's, I think, the ultimate goal of being human. That sense of, if I do it again, I'll do it better. Isn't that just fantastic? So reassuring. This is a 3-hour, as I say, 3.5-hour painting. And I learnt more in those 3 hours than I would in watching, 24 hours worth of YouTube videos of other people doing better paintings than me. Doing it yourself is the ultimate sort of way to learn. You can only learn so much from watching other people do stuff. If you want to know how to swim, you've got to get in a pool. You can't learn it from a video, He said, from experience. One thing I would like to be able to do is to be quick with oil, by which I mean sketchier. I can be quick with watercolor, I can be quick with pen. And with oil, it triggers that sense of this has to be proper feeling within me. So I feel as if I have to take a certain amount of time to get a certain amount of white. And at this moment, for example, I'm not looking at it thinking, well, I could just stop now. I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got to get this done within a certain amount of time. There's not exactly a panic, but there's a sense of there's stuff that has to happen to this painting for it to feel better, for it to feel right. So basically enhancements and little moments. There's what I call the dibby dabby stage. So a little dab of colour there, a little dab of colour here. And a way of, by putting on these little marks, you're adding that sort of visual complexity that tricks the eye into seeing more detail than there's really there. And that's a big part of oil painting. If you go into a gallery and you stand 10 meters away from a wonderful painting, an oil painting, and you look at it and you think that's a masterful piece, look at the fineness and the delicacy, and then you walk up and you stand within a foot, 300 millimeters of it, without being told off by the security guards, and you look super close and you can see the brush strokes, and you suddenly start to say, oh my God, there's a mark there, and there's a mark there, and there's a mark there. It's built out of determined marks, especially if you're looking at something modern. So by modern, I mean something from the last 200 years. That's my idea of modern. So say the Impressionists, they're the obvious ones. If you looked at Cézanne, for example, and you stand a long way and you kind of feel the sort of the sense of the scene, and the closer you get, it breaks down into a series of dibs and dabs in a way that feels like a revelation, because you suddenly see, oh my God, anybody can do that. Anybody can do the dib and dab. The question is, where do you put those marks? And there's no book that could ever tell you, because then it's not logical where those marks are. There's something about understanding what it is and understanding what you want to say about it. And that's determining where those marks go. It's about you and your character, your mindset, how you approach things. That has more influence on every mark you make than anything you're actually looking at. It's, again, your interpretation. Now, I've painted with oils before, of course, but typically when I use oils, I use it in a kind of like I would a line, like I would a sketch. So I'm making marks which are very controlled linear marks. I actively went to paint this thinking I was going to use a scrubbier technique, meaning a more painterly technique, because I don't feel as if that's my area of expertise necessarily, or at all. So therefore, let's explore it. Let's see if I can get better at it. Let's see if I can learn a bit about how this technique can be adapted by my process. How I can take some level of control away from this crazy material, oil paint, and try to kind of corral it into doing a little bit of what I want it to do, but also give it freedom. Allow it to take some of the decisions. Allow it to kind of do what it does. Because if I wanted control, as I said, I'd do a sketch, I'd use watercolor, I'd use acrylic paint, gouache paint. But if I'm using oil, I'm going to relinquish a certain amount of control, because it's so dominant and so powerful. It's going to do what it wants to do. Now, I'll let you into a little secret. In order to do something like this within that kind of time frame, there's only one way I could really reassure myself it was going to be okay. I had to reconnoiter the place in advance. If you actually look at the photograph bottom left, which I took the week before, because I knew I was going to be in the area, I knew I was going to paint, so I went there. I had half an hour coming home from work. I thought, I'll go to Kings Cross now, I'll walk around, I'll take some photographs and find out where my view is, find out what I want. Because on the day, I don't want to be running around thinking, oh my God, what am I going to paint? I don't want to have that as part of my burden for the day. I want to know exactly where I'm going to be positioned and what I'm going to paint and how I'm going to paint it. Now that's where photographs really are incredibly useful, because a photograph is a way of looking at that view and making kind of thinking decisions, visual thinking decisions, putting imagery in your head that makes you respond, so that you can actually walk around. I took maybe 30 photographs, and in those 30 photographs I was looking for an answer, looking for kind of clues to what I was responding to. Partly what I wanted to take photographs of, but also when I took those photographs, when I then said, okay, let's zoom in 10 times, what am I taking a photograph of? How am I responding to this thing? What is it that my eye is going to? And therefore, what is it I would want the viewer to look at? Take, for example, look at the actual size of these, what I call trusses, with a kind of crosshatch pattern of metalwork, this lattice work. Look at the capitals in the painting. They're like 3 or 4 times bigger than they are in reality. You can see in the photograph how fine they are. In my eyes, I saw them as strong, and I wanted to paint them as strong. So I've painted them the wrong size in order to give them power, because it's the power I feel when I'm looking at it. It isn't truthful, because truth doesn't matter. What matters is that the energy of the structure is able to communicate in the way that, as I saw it, as I saw it on that recce, walking around, looking at the thing, and that's how I remember it. In fact, that's a good way of describing it. Painting is how I remember this gas holder to look like. It isn't how a photograph would show it. And I think that's a really fun way of seeing the world, seeing what we do. What we paint, what we sketch is our memory more than the reality. If we want to capture the reality, as I said, take a photograph, that's fine. It's an art form, enjoy it. Now, one of the decisions I did take is that the pencil stage didn't help me as much as I thought, and I didn't really enjoy it. So what I've done in the past is I've done a kind of a very messy, sploshy kind of underpainting first, and I think the next time I do a painting like this, plein air, oil, I think I'll go back to that technique. I think there was something more fluid about it. I think the geometry had obviously, got a bit of nerves in me. I was thinking, will I be able to represent the geometry correctly? And even though I went through the pencil stage, I don't think I actually have. I don't think the pencil stage actually helped me to be more precise. I just think in some ways it's kind of accentuated the errors within my understanding of the geometry. So I look at it now and think, what's the point? You might as well go in and give in to the kind of freedom of a loose underpainting and kind of find the geometry rather than try and precisely just, put those lines down and say, that's it. So anyway, next time I'll be freer. Now this day was set up by the London Plein Air Painters Group, who is a loose association of painterly people. who meet every month and just agree to go somewhere and paint and have a drink afterwards. It's a great idea, you know. There's groups like this all over the place. There'll be a group like this somewhere near you. If you just have to, go on the Instagrams, go on the socials, and find somebody who goes out and does something every now and again, because it gives you a reason to. Would I have got up this morning and gone and painted this were it not for the fact that I was meeting this group of people and we were all going to be doing something in Kings Cross together? No, I don't think I would. You only go because, you said you'd go, so you don't want to let anybody down. And it's lovely. Whenever you join a group like this, there's, together, you know what it's like. Any kind of group of people, you feel more comfortable, stronger, you feel braver, because you've got people around you who are experiencing exactly the same things you are and demonstrating all the same courage that you yourself want to demonstrate. So you all help each other, really, don't you? And at the end of the painting, end of the session, you're looking at what everybody else has done and thinking, oh my God, they've done really well, and they're coming up to you and saying, oh, you've done really well. And it's a big love fest, a big hug. It's really sweet. Artisty people, sketching people, the urban sketcher community, they're a really fun group of people to get involved in, because there's something very relaxed and informal and a sort of an agreed, let's go for it feel about it. Very unpressured and very uncritical. In fact, zero criticism. That's kind of one of the things, No one's into a critique at the end of the session. Everyone's just into a smile. Really a positive experience. I recommend it. Now we're coming to the end of the painting now, and it's time for lunch. There's the weird thing about painting like this is 3 hours can just go like that, and by the time you get to a point of finishing, you suddenly think, oh my God, I'm hungry and I'm thirsty and I need a loo. So perhaps I should advise you, if you do anything like this, take some sandwiches and some water. Be prepared. Here's my camera set up, a little bit of paper in there to stop the sun from getting in the lens too much. And I always like to take a final shot that just goes from the final piece to the view as a kind of a memory aid for myself, that way of saying, okay, job done, now I can walk away. Final piece. I've learned a lot. I don't particularly like it, as I said. It's a bit too but I enjoyed it, and I'll do it again. And I hope you'll try something similar. It's fun. And why not? Try blue and orange. They're a great complementary set of colours.